In the vast darkness between stars, humanity's greatest questions have always remained unanswered. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? In 2089, archaeologists Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway believed they found a signpost pointing to these answers. Identical star maps appearing across ancient civilizations separated by thousands of miles and years, all pointing to a distant moon designated LV-223. What began as an archaeological curiosity would become mankind's most ambitious journey, a trillion-dollar expedition aboard the scientific vessel Prometheus, funded by the dying industrialist Peter Weyland. His corporation spared no expense, assembling a crew of scientists, security personnel, and specialists, along with David, an advanced android with inscrutable motivations. Their mission: to meet our makers, the beings Shaw called engineers, who might hold the secrets to human creation and perhaps even salvation from death itself. As the Prometheus approaches LV-223 after 2 years in deep space stasis, none aboard can imagine the ancient horrors that await them. Biological weapons of unimaginable power, the dark intentions of their supposed creators, and the terrible price of seeking knowledge from gods who may wish they had never created us at all. In their search for the beginning of mankind, they will instead discover something far more terrifying, a legacy that threatens the very future of the human race. Chapter 1. Ancient Origins. The cave's darkness swallowed Elizabeth Shaw as she descended deeper into the Scottish Highlands, her headlamp cutting through millennia of stillness like the first light of creation. Ancient air, undisturbed for 12,000 years, caressed her face as dust motes danced in her beam. With each careful step over the uneven ground, the archaeologist felt the weight of anticipation building. The same feeling that had guided her through digs across 7 continents, the whispered promise of discovery that kept her searching long after others had abandoned hope. "Charlie," she called, her voice echoing in the subterranean chamber. "I found something." Ahead of her, the beam of light revealed paintings covering the curved wall of the cavern, ochre and charcoal figures that had witnessed the passage of countless generations in perfect silence. At the center of the prehistoric mural stood a massive figure, its proportions inhuman yet unmistakably deliberate, a giant pointing to a configuration of stars. Charlie Holloway navigated the narrow passage to join her, his rugged features illuminated by his own light source. Unlike Shaw's methodical approach, Charlie moved with an impatient energy that had propelled him to the forefront of archaeological innovation, if not always academic respect. The two were opposites in many ways: her quiet faith against his scientific skepticism, her patience against his restlessness. Yet they had become inseparable, bound by their shared obsession with humanity's most fundamental questions. "Tell me that's what I think it is," Charlie said, his breath visible in the cool air. Elizabeth removed her glove and reached toward the painting, hovering her fingers just above the surface without touching. "It's identical," she whispered, "to the ones in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Yucatan." Her light traced the sequence of dots above the giant figure. Same configuration, same relative size difference, same everything. From a culture that had no contact with the others, that couldn't possibly have seen the same stars from northern Scotland as they could from Mesoamerica, Charlie added, the implications hanging between them like a physical presence. "It can't be a coincidence." "It isn't," Elizabeth said, removing a small pendant from beneath her thermal jacket, a simple cross that had belonged to her father. She clutched it momentarily before tucking it away, a habitual gesture that Charlie had stopped commenting on years ago. "Same as the others, it's an invitation. And for the first time, we have carbon dating to prove these are the oldest." Charlie's voice rose with excitement as he began photographing the discovery from multiple angles. "Liz, this proves the connection. This proves everything we've been saying." Elizabeth did not immediately share his exuberance. The magnitude of what they had discovered, what it meant for human history, for the very definition of humanity itself, was almost too vast to comprehend in this moment, standing in the dirt where some ancient hand had once pressed pigment to stone. If they were right, nothing would ever be the same. Not science, not faith, not the fundamental story humans told themselves about their place in the cosmos. "Charlie," she said softly, "if we're right, somebody made us, engineered us, and left us directions to find them." Charlie grinned, the boyish enthusiasm that had first drawn her to him bright in his eyes. "Then let's not keep them waiting any longer." Peter Weyland was dying. Not that anyone in the auditorium could tell as he strode across the stage with practiced confidence, his tailored suit and erect posture betraying none of the decay that was consuming him from within. At 86, the founder and CEO of Wayland Industries commanded the room as he had commanded entire sectors of the global economy for half a century. The holographic audience, beamed in from research centers, universities, and Wayland facilities worldwide, watched with the reverence typically reserved for religious figures. A king has his reign, and then he dies. It's inevitable. Wayland's voice carried effortlessly through the space. That is the natural order of things. But should it be? Behind him, screens displayed the accumulated achievements of Wayland Industries. Cybernetic interfaces, tissue regeneration, atmospheric processors that had opened previously uninhabitable regions of Earth to human settlement. Each innovation had been heralded as revolutionary. Each had made Wayland obscenely wealthy, and none had satisfied the hunger that drove him. "We are the gods now," Wayland continued. "We create cybernetic individuals who, in just a few short years, will be completely indistinguishable from us. We create new life forms that thrive where nothing could grow before. Yet, for all our achievements, death remains the one unavoidable certainty." The holographic audience shifted uncomfortably. Death was not a popular topic among the ultra-wealthy tech elite, who spent billions developing methods to delay its arrival. "I am not content with the inevitable," Wayland declared, "and neither should you be, which is why I have decided to change the natural order." With a gesture, the screens shifted to display the star configuration that Shaw and Holloway had discovered across ancient civilizations. These star maps, recently authenticated by Doctors Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway, appear in the art of civilizations separated by centuries and continents, long before interplanetary travel was possible. They point to a single location, not in our solar system, but within reach. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "We have not been abandoned," he said, with the gravity of a prophet revealing divine truth. "We have been invited, and I intend to accept that invitation." The Prometheus mission will launch next year with a full scientific team to this precise location. We will meet our makers, these engineers, as Dr. Shaw calls them, and we will ask them the most fundamental question possible. Can they save us from death itself? The final screens displayed the majestic craft already under construction in the Wayland Orbital Shipyard. The USCSS Prometheus, named for the Titan who stole fire from the gods to elevate humanity, only to face eternal punishment for his transgression. Few in the audience noted the hubris in selecting this particular mythological figure as their standard bearer. "Now, I need a team," Wayland said, his eyes scanning the audience. "The best minds humanity has to offer, for what is arguably the most important journey in our history." The speech ended to thunderous applause, as Wayland's theatrical performances always did. Only his personal physician, positioned discreetly in the wings, knew that the medical report waiting on her tablet gave the great man less than 2 years to live. Not nearly enough time to launch a mission, travel to a distant star system, and return. But then, Peter Wayland had never intended to return. 3 days after Wayland's announcement, Elizabeth Shaw sat in her London apartment surrounded by packed boxes, staring at her secure tablet as messages flooded in from colleagues worldwide. Some congratulated her on the breakthrough. Others questioned her methodology. A few condemned her outright for what they called irresponsible pseudoscience, alleging she had allowed her religious background to cloud her judgment. The criticism stung, but it wasn't unexpected. Throughout her career, Elizabeth had faced skepticism from peers who believed her father's vocation as a Christian missionary had compromised her objectivity. What they failed to understand was that her faith wasn't a hindrance to her work. It was the engine that drove it. Not blind dogmatism, but the belief that the universe operated according to a purpose, that the spark of consciousness that separated humans from other life forms wasn't merely a random evolutionary accident. Her tablet chimed with an incoming call from Charlie, and she accepted it immediately. His face appeared, flushed with excitement. "Have you seen it?" he asked without preamble. "The press release?" "Yes. It's everywhere." "Not the press release," Charlie said impatiently. "The funding package. Check your email. Full budget approval, Liz. Everything we asked for and more. Wayland's giving us the keys to the kingdom." She navigated to her email as Charlie continued speaking, outlining plans that had clearly been forming in his mind since the moment they'd discovered the star map. When she saw the figure attached to the expedition budget, she nearly dropped the tablet. "This can't be real," she murmured. It is, Charlie assured her. And they want us on a flight to the Wayland Biotech facility tomorrow. Apparently, pre-mission medical screenings start immediately. Elizabeth should have felt elated. This was validation of their life's work, the opportunity to prove what they had believed all along. But as she looked around at her apartment, at the small collection of her father's artifacts she had inherited, at the photographs of indigenous archaeological sites where she had built relationships over decades, she felt a curious hollowness. They were about to embark on a journey that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of itself, and all she could think about was what they might lose in the process. What if we're wrong, Charlie? She asked quietly. His smile faltered for the first time. Wrong about what? Any of it. The maps. The engineers. What if we're seeing connections that aren't there? The connections are there, Liz. We've proven it. But what about our interpretations? What if it's not an invitation? What if it's a warning? Charlie's expression softened. This wasn't their first conversation about the potential implications of their discovery. Look, best case scenario, we find what we've spent our careers looking for. Worst case, we discover a new celestial body that no human has ever visited, collect unprecedented scientific data, and come home to a place in the history books. Either way, we win. Elizabeth wasn't convinced, but she forced a smile. I'll see you at Heathrow tomorrow, then? Wouldn't miss it, Charlie replied, his enthusiasm returning. Get some sleep. We're about to meet our makers. The call ended, and Elizabeth set aside the tablet. She crossed to the window, looking out at the London skyline with its mixture of ancient cathedrals and modern architecture reaching toward the heavens. For thousands of years, humans had built upward, always straining to touch the divine. Now they would travel across stars to confront it directly. She removed her father's cross from her neck and held it to the light, the simple silver shape catching the glow of the setting sun. What would you think of all this, Dad? She whispered. Your daughter, searching for God with a corporate checkbook. That night, Elizabeth Shaw dreamed of distant stars and ancient paintings coming to life beneath her fingers. She dreamed of giants walking beside her father on uncharted worlds. She dreamed of fire stolen from Olympus, burning everything it touched. And she dreamed of a voice that might have been her father's or might have been something older, asking simply, Are you certain you want the answers to your questions? By morning, she couldn't remember any of it. The Wayland Biotech facility sprawled across 50 acres of secured land outside Boston, its gleaming white buildings stark against the surrounding forest. After passing through 3 security checkpoints, Elizabeth and Charlie were escorted to the medical screening wing, where they underwent a battery of tests more comprehensive than either had experienced before. Is all this really necessary? Charlie asked as a technician drew his 12th vial of blood. We're archaeologists, not astronauts. The technician, who had introduced herself only as Dr. Hart, offered a professionally bland smile. Mr. Wayland insists that all mission personnel meet enhanced physical standards. Deep space travel involves risks we're still quantifying. How many people are being screened? Elizabeth asked from the adjacent examination table. Thousands, Dr. Hart replied. Mr. Wayland is personally reviewing the final selections. The thought of Peter Wayland, a man they had never met outside his public appearances, scrutinizing their medical profiles was unsettling, but neither archaeologist commented further. The opportunity was too valuable to jeopardize with unnecessary questions. After the medical examinations came psychological evaluations, aptitude tests, and a series of increasingly peculiar assessments that seemed designed to measure their responses to stress, isolation, and existential uncertainty. By the 5th day, Elizabeth began to suspect they were being tested not only for physical fitness, but for some specific psychological profile that Wayland deemed necessary for the mission. On the 6th day, they were summoned to a conference room overlooking the facility's central atrium. The space was dominated by a holographic projection system that displayed a slowly rotating model of the Prometheus vessel. Standing beside it was a woman in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a slate-gray suit that screamed corporate authority. Dr. Shaw, Dr. Holloway, she greeted them with a perfunctory handshake. Meredith Vickers, Director of Private Operations for Wayland Industries. I'll be overseeing the Prometheus mission. There was something familiar in her features, a resemblance to someone Elizabeth couldn't quite place. Before she could consider it further, Vickers activated the holographic display, expanding the ship model to show its internal compartments. Construction is proceeding ahead of schedule, Vickers explained, her tone making it clear that anything less would have been unacceptable. We'll launch in 14 months. The journey to LV-223 will take approximately 2 years, 9 months. You'll be in hypersleep for the duration. LV-223? Charlie questioned. The designation we've assigned to the moon that appears to be the destination indicated by your star maps, Vickers clarified. It orbits a planet in the Zeta II Reticuli system. Elizabeth felt a momentary disorientation. After years of referring to the location as the invitation, or the engineer coordinates, the clinical corporate designation seemed to strip away the wonder of what they had discovered. Who else will be joining the mission? She asked. Vickers gestured, and personnel profiles began appearing on secondary displays around the room. Captain Yannick, one of our most experienced deep space pilots. A full medical team led by Dr. Ford. Geologist Fifield, biologist Milburn. Security personnel under the command of mercenary Captain Chance. Engineers Ravel and Taplow will maintain the ship's systems. She swiped through several more profiles. In total, a crew of 17 specialists. 17 seems like a small crew for a mission of this magnitude, Charlie observed. Vickers' expression remained impassive. The Prometheus is designed to operate with minimal personnel. This keeps life support requirements manageable for extended missions. And Mr. Wayland? Elizabeth asked. Will he be joining us? Something flickered across Vickers' face. Tension, perhaps, or carefully controlled irritation. Mr. Wayland is fully committed to the mission's success, but his schedule doesn't permit personal participation. He sends his regards and his utmost confidence in your work. Elizabeth wasn't convinced by the explanation. A man who had dedicated his life to challenging death itself would surely want to be present for what could be the most significant encounter in human history. But she didn't press the issue. There's someone else you should meet, Vickers continued, pressing a control on her wrist device. He'll be your primary mission support. The door slid open, and a figure entered with such fluid grace that it momentarily appeared to be gliding rather than walking. It had the form of a man in his 30s, with meticulously groomed blonde hair and features so symmetrical they bordered on unsettling. It wore a Wayland Industries uniform without insignia or rank markers. Good afternoon, Dr. Shaw, Dr. Holloway. It said, its voice precisely modulated to convey both authority and servility. I'm David. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Elizabeth had seen synthetics before, artificial persons designed for hazardous work environments or specialized tasks too precise for human hands, but never one as advanced as this. David's movements lacked the subtle mechanical tells that usually marked synthetic behavior. If not for the total absence of micro-expressions that would naturally cross a human face during conversation, she might have mistaken him for a biological being. David will serve as your mission coordinator, Vickers explained. He doesn't sleep, doesn't require sustenance, and is programmed with all known archaeological data relevant to your research. He'll monitor the ship while the crew is in hypersleep and assist with all aspects of the mission upon arrival. David smiled, a perfect replication of the facial gesture without the emotional context that typically prompted it. I've studied all your papers, Dr. Shaw. Your work on cross-cultural symbolic transmission is particularly fascinating. I look forward to seeing how your theories align with what we discover. Something in his phrasing struck Elizabeth as odd. Not, I look forward to discovering whether your theories are correct, but an assumption that they would discover something, and that this discovery would have some relationship to her existing research. It suggested a certainty that even she, who had staked her professional reputation on the star maps, didn't fully share. Thank you, she replied, uncertain how else to respond to the synthetic's interest. Vickers checked the time. David will show you to your quarters. You'll begin mission-specific training tomorrow morning. I suggest you rest while you can. The next year will be intensively scheduled. As Vickers departed, David gestured toward the door with a perfectly calibrated host's gesture. This way, please. I believe you'll find the accommodations satisfactory, though somewhat utilitarian. As they followed the synthetic, Charlie leaned close to Elizabeth. Did his smile seem off to you? He whispered. Everything about him seems off, she murmured back. David, walking several paces ahead, spoke without turning. I can adjust my facial expressions if you find them disconcerting, Dr. Holloway. My programming includes over 400 distinct emotional simulations designed to facilitate human comfort. Charlie straightened, embarrassed at being overheard. No, you're fine. Thank you, David replied pleasantly. I'm designed to work alongside humans, so your feedback is valuable. I want nothing more than to be helpful. Something in the way he emphasized the word want made Elizabeth wonder just how sophisticated David's programming really was. Synthetics weren't supposed to have wants or desires, only directives and protocols. This one seemed to be mimicking human motivational language with unsettling precision. Their quarters proved to be adjacent rooms in the residential wing of the facility, sparse but comfortable. David informed them that their personal belongings were being shipped from London and would arrive within days. "Is there anything else you require?" the synthetic asked, hovering in the doorway with perfect stillness. "No, thank you," Elizabeth replied. "Then I'll leave you to rest. Training begins at 0600. David turned to go, then paused. "May I ask a personal question, Dr. Shaw?" The request was so unexpected that she simply nodded. "I understand from your file that you're unable to conceive children," David said, his tone as casual as if commenting on the weather. "Has this affected your interest in the origins of human life?" Elizabeth felt her body go cold. Her infertility was indeed documented in her medical records, but the synthetic's matter-of-fact reference to such a painful personal detail struck her as profoundly inappropriate. "I don't see how that's relevant to our mission," she managed to reply, her voice tight. "Curiosity," David explained with another empty smile. "A trait Mr. Wayland encouraged me to develop. Forgive me if I've overstepped. Good evening, Dr. Shaw, Dr. Holloway." After the door closed behind him, Charlie moved to Elizabeth's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "What the hell was that about?" "I don't know," she said, still shaken. "But I think we should be careful what we say around him." "He's just a synthetic," Charlie said, though his tone lacked conviction. "A tool like any other mission equipment." Elizabeth wasn't so sure. There had been something in David's eyes when he asked about her infertility. Not compassion or cruelty, but a clinical interest that made her feel like a specimen under observation. If the synthetic was merely a tool, she wondered whose hand was truly guiding it. The training year passed in a blur of simulations, briefings, and specialized preparation. Elizabeth and Charlie worked alongside the other selected crew members, learning to operate the advanced equipment they would use to analyze whatever they found on LV-223. They trained in emergency protocols, studied the limited data available on the Zeta-2 reticuli system, and underwent repeated medical evaluations to ensure they remained in peak condition. Throughout it all, David was a constant presence, observing and occasionally participating, though he never again mentioned Elizabeth's personal medical history. The synthetic spent much of its time learning dead languages: Egyptian hieroglyphics, Sumerian cuneiform, Proto-Indo-European root dialects, on the theory that these might share structural elements with whatever communication system the engineers had used. "I find the most efficient approach is total immersion," David explained when Charlie questioned his methodology. "I've watched Lawrence of Arabia exactly 247 times while studying Arabic dialects. The context helps me understand not just linguistic rules but cultural implications." "Why Lawrence of Arabia?" Elizabeth asked, curious despite her lingering wariness of the synthetic. "The protagonist's journey resonates with our mission," David replied. "An explorer venturing into a foreign culture, driven by personal conviction rather than those who employ him. My favorite line is when Lawrence is asked what attracts him to the desert. He replies, 'It's clean.'" David smiled his empty smile. "I find that sentiment elegant in its simplicity." Elizabeth couldn't decide if David's interest in T. Lawrence was a programmed affectation designed to make the synthetic seem more relatable, or if it represented something more complex developing in his artificial consciousness. Either possibility was unsettling. As launch day approached, the crew completed their final preparations with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Elizabeth found herself withdrawing from the group activities, spending more time reviewing the archaeological data that had led them to this point. The night before departure, she sat alone in her quarters, spreading printouts of the ancient star maps across her bed. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. She opened it to find Charlie, holding a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. "Thought we should celebrate," he said, entering without waiting for an invitation. "This time tomorrow, we'll be asleep for nearly 3 years." Elizabeth smiled despite her preoccupation. Charlie's enthusiasm had always been infectious, even in their most challenging moments. She cleared the bed of papers, making space for him to sit beside her. "Having second thoughts?" he asked as he poured the champagne. "No," she said, accepting a glass. "Just making sure we haven't missed anything. After 15 years of research and a year of preparation, if we've missed something, it's too late now. He raised his glass. To finding our makers. She clinked her glass against his, but didn't repeat the toast. Instead, she said, to answers, whatever they may be. They drank in comfortable silence for a moment before Charlie spoke again. Do you remember that dig in Ethiopia? When we found those hominid remains that dated back further than anyone thought possible. Elizabeth nodded. It had been early in their professional relationship, before romance had complicated their partnership. The tribal elder told us we shouldn't disturb the bones because they belonged to the old people. And you told him we were trying to understand where we came from, where he came from. And he said, my people know where we come from. We want to know where we're going. Elizabeth finished the memory with a sad smile. I've thought about that conversation a lot this year. Charlie reached for her hand. We're going to find both, Liz. Where we came from and where we're going. That's why this mission matters so much. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, but didn't respond. She had joined this expedition seeking answers to questions that had defined her life's work. Yet as departure loomed, she found herself increasingly preoccupied with an entirely different question. What would happen if they succeeded? If the engineers existed, if they had created humanity, what did that mean for the faith that had sustained her since childhood? What did it mean for the cross she still wore around her neck? Could she reconcile the God of her father with beings who had seeded Earth with human DNA? And what did the engineers want from their creation after eons of apparent absence? Hey, Charlie said gently, noticing her withdrawal into thought. Where'd you go? Sorry, she said, forcing herself back to the present moment. Just nervous, I guess. That's normal. But we've done the work, Liz. We're ready. She nodded, not wanting to dampen his excitement with her doubts. Tomorrow they would leave Earth behind, suspended in artificial sleep while their ship traversed the void between stars. And when they woke, perhaps they would finally stand face to face with their creators. Or perhaps they would find only ruins, or nothing at all. Another dead moon orbiting a distant star, mute and indifferent to human questions. Elizabeth wasn't sure which outcome frightened her more. Whatever we find, Charlie said, raising his glass again, we find it together. This time, Elizabeth repeated his toast. Together. Hours later, after Charlie had returned to his own quarters, Elizabeth knelt beside her bed in a posture her father would have recognized. She clutched her cross and whispered the prayer that had sustained her through every challenge. Lord, give me the strength to accept whatever truths await us. As dawn broke on their last day on Earth, Elizabeth Shaw packed her few personal belongings, including her father's cross and a photograph of her parents, and prepared to depart for a destiny inscribed in stone 12,000 years before her birth. Whatever answers awaited in the stars, she was finally ready to receive them. Chapter 2. The Derelict Temple. The return to consciousness was violent. Elizabeth Shaw's eyes snapped open as her body convulsed, the hypersleep chamber's lid retracting with a pneumatic hiss. Her lungs burned as if she'd been holding her breath for days, rather than metabolically suspended for years. Disorientation clouded her thoughts, a side effect of extended stasis that the preparatory briefings had mentioned but couldn't truly convey. For several terrifying seconds, she couldn't remember her name, her purpose, or why she lay naked in a translucent sarcophagus aboard a vessel humming with mechanical life. Then memory cascaded back like a digital download completing its transfer. Elizabeth Shaw. Archaeologist. The Prometheus mission. LV-223. A wave of nausea struck her as the hypersleep chamber's chemical suppressants wore off. She barely managed to roll onto her side before emptying her stomach of the nutrient gel that had sustained her during the long journey. A medical drone whirred to life, cleaning the mess with mechanical efficiency as Elizabeth struggled to control her trembling limbs. The first few minutes are the worst, came a voice both familiar and strange after years of silence. David stood nearby, his posture perfect as ever, not a hair out of place. The synthetic wore a crisp Wayland uniform and observed her with clinical interest. Your biological functions are normalizing according to expected parameters. Would you like assistance? Elizabeth shook her head, determined to regain control of her body without the synthetic's help. She reached for the medical gown folded beside her chamber, cursing her clumsy fingers as they fumbled with the thin fabric. How long? She managed to ask, her voice raspy from disuse. 2 years, 4 months, 18 days, 36 minutes, 15 seconds. David replied with unnecessary precision. We've arrived at LV-223 on schedule. The rest of the crew is awakening now. As if to confirm his statement, the sound of retching came from across the stasis bay. Elizabeth turned to see Charlie hunched over the side of his chamber, his body going through the same violent reintegration process. Around them, other pods were opening, disgorging their human cargo back into conscious existence. I've prepared a light protein supplement and hydration formula for each crew member, David continued, unperturbed by the chorus of groans and gasps filling the chamber. Captain Yannick has asked that you all convene in the bridge briefing room once you're sufficiently recovered. Estimated time, 42 minutes. Elizabeth nodded weakly, still unable to form complete sentences. David smiled his perfect, empty smile and moved away to assist the ship's medical officer, who was struggling to stand on atrophied legs. Charlie made his way to Elizabeth's side, his complexion ashen but his eyes already regaining their characteristic intensity. Hell of a wake-up call, he managed, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. Did you dream? Elizabeth considered the question. Hypersleep was supposed to suspend all neural activity, rendering dreams impossible. Yet fragmented images lingered at the edges of her consciousness. A cave painting coming to life beneath her fingers, giant pale figures walking across an alien landscape, her father holding her hand as a child and pointing to the stars. I don't think so, she lied, unsure why she felt compelled to conceal these impossible memories. You. Charlie shook his head. Just darkness. Then David's face hovering over me like some kind of android angel of resurrection. He glanced toward the synthetic, who was now efficiently moving between crew members, distributing medical supplements. Did he watch us the whole time? While we were sleeping. I monitored all crew life signs as part of my primary directive, David answered from across the room, his hearing apparently far more acute than his human creators. I also maintained ship functions, conducted stellar observations, and prepared preliminary surveys of LV-223 as we entered orbit. The casual reminder of the synthetic's unwavering vigilance sent an involuntary shiver through Elizabeth. For nearly 2.5 years, David had moved through the Prometheus while they slept the sole conscious entity aboard. What had he done during those long, silent months? What thoughts, if thoughts was even the right word for whatever processes occurred in his artificial mind, had occupied him? And, Charlie prompted, either missing or ignoring Elizabeth's discomfort. What did you find? David's expression remained neutral. I believe Ms. Vickers would prefer I share those findings with the entire crew simultaneously. If you'll excuse me, I need to assist Captain Yannick. As the synthetic moved away, Charlie squeezed Elizabeth's shoulder. We made it, Liz. We're really here. Despite her physical discomfort, Elizabeth felt the first stirrings of the wonder that had driven her across billions of miles of void. They had arrived at the destination indicated by star maps etched by ancient civilizations that couldn't possibly have known of its existence. Whatever awaited them on the surface of LV-223, it represented the culmination of her life's work, the potential answer to humanity's most fundamental questions. Come on, she said, finally trusting her voice. Let's get dressed. I want to see it. 40 minutes later, dressed in Wayland-issued uniforms that fit with suspicious precision after years in stasis, the crew gathered on the bridge. Through the Prometheus's vast forward viewport stretched a vista no human eyes had ever beheld. The curved horizon of LV-223, a moon orbiting a ringed gas giant in the Zeta-2 Reticuli system. Captain Yannick, a veteran deep space pilot with the weathered face and stoic demeanor of a man who had seen the furthest reaches of human exploration, gestured toward the alien panorama. Welcome to your new home, at least for the next few weeks. Gravity is 0.86 Earth standard. Atmosphere is primarily nitrogen, oxygen levels at 21.4%. Technically breathable but thin. Surface temperature averages -15 Celsius. Breathable air? Milburn, the expedition's biologist, questioned. That's statistically improbable for a random celestial body. Which suggests it's not random at all, Elizabeth interjected, unable to contain her excitement. The star maps led us to a place that can sustain human life. That can't be coincidence. Before anyone could respond, the bridge door slid open to admit Meredith Vickers. Unlike the rest of the crew, who still showed signs of hypersleep recovery, the mission director appeared immaculate, as if she had stepped directly from a Wayland Industries boardroom rather than a stasis pod. Let's not jump to conclusions, Dr. Shaw, she said coolly. Orbital scans show no obvious signs of civilization or artificial structures. If your engineers were ever here, they left no clear evidence of their presence. Elizabeth felt a flash of irritation at Vickers' dismissive tone. Before she could respond, David stepped forward, activating a holographic display at the center of the bridge. Actually, Ms. Vickers, that's not entirely accurate. The synthetic manipulated the controls, zooming in on a section of the moon's surface. During my orbital surveys, I detected this topographical anomaly. The hologram resolved to show a perfectly straight line cutting across an otherwise natural landscape, a ridge that extended for nearly 2 kilometers before terminating in a dome-like structure partially embedded in the side of a mountain. That's not a natural formation, Charlie said, leaning forward to study the image. No, David agreed. The probability of such geometric regularity occurring without intelligent intervention is approximately 1 in 7 trillion. What you're seeing appears to be an artificial structure, consistent with advanced engineering principles. A hushed silence fell over the bridge as the implications set in. They weren't just exploring an alien moon. They were looking at evidence of an alien civilization, one that might have created humanity itself. Captain Yanak was the first to break the silence. How far from our current position? Approximately 31 kilometers, David replied. Well within range of our ground transport vehicles. Weather conditions? Yanak asked, already shifting into mission mode. A storm system is developing in the area, David said. Estimated window of optimal landing conditions is 14 hours, after which exploratory operations may become hazardous. Yanak nodded, making a quick decision. Prep for planetary descent. We'll establish base camp at a safe distance from the structure and deploy ground teams before the storm hits. I want to be on the first team to approach the structure, Elizabeth said immediately. As do I, Charlie added. Vickers' expression tightened with barely concealed irritation. This isn't an archaeological dig on Earth, doctors. We follow standard exploratory protocols. A security team will assess potential threats before scientific personnel are cleared to approach. With respect, Ms. Vickers, Elizabeth countered, Charlie and I have spent our careers studying precisely the kinds of cross-cultural symbolic patterns that might help us recognize and interpret what we find. If this structure was built by the engineers, we're the most qualified to make that initial assessment. Before Vickers could object further, Captain Yanak intervened. I suggest a compromise. Security establishes a perimeter, then Doctors Shaw and Holloway approach with David and 2 security personnel. The rest of the team remains on standby at base camp until we confirm it's safe. Vickers clearly wanted to assert her authority, but Yanak's suggestion was reasonable enough that objecting would make her appear obstructionist. Very well, she conceded reluctantly. But I want constant communication and visual feeds. At the first sign of anything potentially hazardous, you withdraw immediately. Understood. Elizabeth nodded, too elated at the prospect of being among the first to approach the structure to argue about conditions. After 15 years of research and nearly 3 years of travel, she was hours away from potentially coming face to face with humanity's creators. Dr. Shaw, David said as the briefing dispersed. You might want to see this before we descend. The synthetic led her to a small observation dome off the main bridge, where the gas giant that LV-223 orbited filled the view. Bands of swirling storms stretched across its massive surface, and its rings glittered like diamond dust against the void. It's beautiful, Elizabeth breathed, momentarily overwhelmed by the cosmic spectacle. Yes, David agreed, though Elizabeth wondered what beauty meant to a synthetic. Could he appreciate the aesthetic wonder of such a sight, or was he merely acknowledging a pattern of light and color that his programming told him humans would find pleasing? I've had considerable time to observe it, David continued. 2 years for months, 18 days to be precise. Do you know what I discovered during that time? Elizabeth glanced at him, curious despite her lingering unease in his presence. What? That no matter how long I observed, how many measurements I took, how many spectrographic analyses I performed, I could never truly capture the totality of what I was seeing. David's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression of thoughtfulness. There is a difference between data and experience, Dr. Shaw. Between knowing and understanding. Elizabeth studied the synthetic, unsure what to make of this philosophical turn. Why are you telling me this, David? Because I believe you understand that difference. Your search for the engineers isn't merely an academic exercise. You're seeking meaning, not just data. David tilted his head slightly. I find that fascinating. Before Elizabeth could respond to this unexpected insight, the ship's intercom announced that planetary descent preparations were underway. David's expression returned to its usual neutral efficiency. We should join the others, he said. There's much to prepare before we meet your makers. The descent through LV-223's atmosphere was rougher than expected, the Prometheus buffeted by winds that Yanak navigated with experienced hands. Elizabeth watched through a viewport as the alien landscape rushed toward them. A barren expanse of rock and dust under a perpetually twilight sky, the massive gas giant hanging overhead like a watchful deity. They established base camp 3 kilometers from the mysterious structure, deploying pressurized habitat modules and environmental monitoring equipment with practiced efficiency. Despite the technically breathable atmosphere, all personnel wore lightweight environmental suits as a precaution against unknown contaminants. The exploration team departed in 2 terrain vehicles as soon as base camp was secure. Elizabeth sat beside Charlie in the lead vehicle, her heartbeat quickening as they approached the structure that had appeared so geometric and artificial from orbit. Up close, the true scale of the edifice became apparent. What they had taken for a modest dome was in fact a massive construction, at least 500 meters across and 200 meters high. The mountain it nestled against wasn't natural either. It was part of the structure, an artificial elevation designed to conceal most of the building from aerial observation. It's a deliberate design choice, Charlie murmured as they stopped the vehicles at a respectful distance. They built it to be hidden. Or protected, Elizabeth suggested. Look at how the mountain shields it from the prevailing weather patterns. David, who had been scanning the structure continuously since their approach, spoke up. There are entry points on the eastern face, and I'm detecting faint power signatures emanating from within, negligible by our standards, but definitely artificial. The security team established a perimeter while Elizabeth, Charlie, and David prepared to approach the entrance. Fifield, the expedition's geologist, and Milburn, the biologist, joined them at the last minute, eager to be part of the historic first contact. Remember, constant communication. Vickers' voice came through their helmet comms from base camp. Visual feeds operational at all times. The small team made their way toward the eastern face of the structure, crossing a field of strange, egg-like formations that protruded from the ground at regular intervals. These aren't natural, Fifield said, scanning one with his handheld geological analyzer. Some kind of synthetic material, formed with mathematical precision. They're markers, Elizabeth realized suddenly, like the standing stones at ancient sites on Earth, designed to guide visitors along a specific approach path. Following the implicit guidance of the markers, they reached an immense doorway set into the curved wall of the structure. No obvious control mechanism was visible, but as they approached, subtle symbols became visible on the surface surrounding the entrance, geometric patterns reminiscent of the ancient carvings that had led them here. Look at these, Elizabeth said excitedly, recording the symbols with her suit's camera. They match elements from Sumerian and Proto-Hittite writing systems, but with structural variations consistent with independent development. Can you read them? Charlie asked. Not yet, but there are recognizable ideographic elements. This one here, she pointed to a repeated symbol, appears to be a conceptual representation of creation or Genesis. Fascinating, David murmured, reaching out to touch one of the symbols. As his synthetic fingers made contact, a subtle vibration ran through the doorway, and segments of the massive portal began to reconfigure, folding inward with a precision that defied the structure's apparent age. It's opening, Charlie whispered unnecessarily, awe evident in his voice. Motion triggered? Fifield suggested. No, David corrected. The door wasn't merely waiting for physical contact. It was dormant until a specific interaction occurred. It may have recognized a pattern in our approach, or responded to some quality in our biochemistry. Or recognized you as one of them, Elizabeth said quietly. David turned to her with an expression of mild curiosity. An interesting hypothesis, Dr. Shaw. Do you believe the engineers also created artificial persons? Before she could answer, the door completed its reconfiguration, revealing a dark passage leading into the heart of the structure. Suit lights activated automatically, illuminating a corridor of imposing proportions, its walls covered in the same enigmatic symbols that had adorned the entrance. Atmosphere inside is similar to exterior conditions, Milburn reported, checking his environmental scanner. Temperature slightly higher. No detectable toxins or pathogens. We're proceeding inside, Charlie reported to base camp. Maintain communication link. The team moved forward cautiously, their lights casting long shadows across the alien architecture. The corridor's proportions were subtly disorienting, slightly too large for human comfort, as if designed for beings of greater stature. These builders were tall, Charlie observed, measuring the height of a decorative alcove against his own body. 2.5, maybe 3 meters. Consistent with the proportions depicted in the ancient star maps, Elizabeth agreed. The giants weren't symbolic after all, they were literal representations. The corridor opened into a vast chamber with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above them. Their lights couldn't penetrate to its full height, creating the unsettling impression that the room extended infinitely upward. At the center of the chamber stood a monolithic statue, humanoid in general form but with proportions and features distinctly non-human. An oversized head with minimal facial features, elongated limbs, and a musculature that suggested immense physical power. "My God," Elizabeth breathed, her voice hushed with reverence. "Engineer," Charlie corrected with a smile. "I believe we've found what we came for." David approached the statue, scanning it with his specialized sensors. The material composition is unlike anything in our database. A carbon-silicon hybrid with properties that suggest both organic and inorganic origins. "How old is it?" Elizabeth asked. "Based on surface degradation patterns, approximately 2,000 years, David replied, though the structure itself appears significantly older. Elizabeth tried to process this information. 2,000 years, roughly coinciding with the time of Christ on Earth. Was there a connection? Had something happened here that corresponded with one of humanity's most significant religious turning points? The implications were dizzying. Beyond the statue, the chamber branched into multiple corridors. Soft, ambient light began to suffuse the space, not from any visible source, but as if the very walls were responding to their presence by generating a subtle luminescence. "The power signatures are increasing," David noted. "The facility appears to be activating in response to our presence." "Like it was waiting for us," Charlie said, excitement overriding caution. "Let's see where these passages lead." "We should stay together," Fifield objected, glancing nervously at the darkened corridors. The geologist had maintained a professional demeanor until now, but the alien environment was clearly testing his composure. "We'll cover more ground if we split up," Charlie countered. "Elizabeth and I will take the central passage with David. Fifield, you and Milburn check the right branch. Stay in constant contact." Elizabeth wasn't entirely comfortable with the plan, but recognized the logic. With a storm approaching and limited time for their initial exploration, they needed to gather as much data as possible. The central passage led them deeper into the structure, the architecture becoming increasingly complex and organic in appearance. The walls were no longer smooth but textured with flowing patterns that resembled something between technological circuitry and biological systems. "It's like the building is alive," Elizabeth observed, running her gloved hand along one of the patterns, "or was designed to mimic living tissue." "Perhaps the distinction wasn't relevant to its creators," David suggested. "The integration of biological and technological elements appears fundamental to engineer design philosophy." They entered another chamber, smaller than the first but more elaborate in its contents. Alcoves lined the walls, each containing what appeared to be cylindrical containers of some translucent material. A central pedestal housed what could only be described as a control system, a series of crystalline interfaces arranged in patterns similar to the symbols they had observed throughout the structure. "This is incredible," Charlie said, approaching the containers. "Some kind of storage system?" David moved to the central pedestal, his synthetic fingers hovering above its surface. The patterns suggest an interactive interface, similar to how the entrance responded to touch. "Be careful," Elizabeth cautioned, but her warning came too late. David placed his hand on the crystalline surface, and the entire chamber surged with sudden activity. The ambient light intensified, and the containers in the alcoves began to glow with an internal phosphorescence. Within them, dark shapes became visible, objects suspended in some kind of preservation medium. "They're artifacts," Charlie said, moving closer to examine the nearest container. "Or specimens." Elizabeth joined him, peering through the translucent material. What she saw defied immediate categorization, neither clearly biological nor artificial, but something that existed at the intersection of both realms. The object resembled a complex organic mechanism, with components that suggested both evolutionary development and deliberate design. "What is it?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. "Unknown," David replied, still interacting with the control pedestal. "But the facility's systems are becoming increasingly responsive. I believe I can access its data archives." As David worked, the light within the containers began to shift, patterns of luminescence spreading through the preservation medium. Elizabeth noticed with alarm that the dark shapes were changing, subtle movements that suggested dormancy rather than inertness. "Charlie," she said quietly, "I think these might be alive." Charlie stepped back from the container he had been examining. "Dormant, maybe. In stasis, like we were on the journey here." "We should report this to base camp," Elizabeth said, suddenly conscious of how far they had ventured from the entrance. "Vickers needs to know what we've found." She activated her comm link, but only static responded. "Communications are down," she reported, checking her equipment. "Some kind of interference." "The storm might be intensifying," Charlie suggested. "Or something in the structure's composition is blocking our signals." "We should return to the entrance," Elizabeth insisted. "Re-establish contact before proceeding further." Charlie nodded reluctantly, his explorer's curiosity clearly warring with protocol. "David, we need to go back." The synthetic continued his interaction with the control system, his expression unnaturally focused. "One moment. I'm detecting a data stream that may contain crucial information about the facility's purpose." "David," Elizabeth said more firmly, "we're leaving now." The synthetic finally withdrew his hand from the pedestal, but something had changed in his demeanor. A subtle shift that Elizabeth couldn't quite define, but that raised her instinctive wariness. "Of course, Dr. Shaw," he said with his usual pleasant efficiency. "Though you might be interested to know that I've determined the nature of this facility." "Which is?" Charlie prompted. "Based on the architectural configuration and the contents of these storage units, this appears to be a military installation," David said. "Or more precisely, a weapons development laboratory." The declaration hung in the recycled air of their environmental suits, its implications expanding like a silent explosion. Elizabeth felt a cold dread settling in her stomach, replacing the wonder and excitement of their discoveries. "Are you certain?" she asked. "The patterns are consistent with no other interpretation," David replied. "And there's more. The engineers were here more recently than we initially estimated. The facility's last active period was approximately 2,000 years ago, at which point it appears to have been abruptly abandoned." "Abandoned because of what?" Charlie asked, glancing at the glowing containers with new apprehension. David's perfect features arranged themselves into an expression that might have been concern on a human face. "That, Dr. Holloway, is the question we should be asking. Why would the creators of humanity abandon an advanced weapons facility? And more importantly, what were they developing here that necessitated such abrupt departure?" As if in answer to his question, a distant sound echoed through the corridors. Something between a mechanical failure and a biological cry, alien and deeply unsettling. The three explorers turned toward the source, their suit lights illuminating only empty passage. "We need to find Fifield and Milburn," Elizabeth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Now, the temple that had seemed a monument to creation just hours before now felt like something else entirely. A mausoleum for secrets that had perhaps been better left buried. As they hurried back toward the main chamber, Elizabeth clutched her father's cross through her suit material, a reflexive gesture seeking comfort from a faith suddenly complicated by the possibility that humanity's creators had been not gods of benevolence, but architects of destruction. Chapter 3. Contamination. As the exploration team approached the colossal structure, Elizabeth's heart raced with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. The sheer scale of the artificial construct was awe-inspiring, dwarfing even the mighty Prometheus that had brought them here. Etched into the mountain's facade were intricate geometric patterns, hinting at an advanced design aesthetic completely foreign to human experience. Elizabeth gripped the side of the vehicle, her fingers trembling slightly. After decades of research, she was finally standing in the shadow of humanity's creators, the mythical engineers whose existence had consumed her life's work. What would they find within those imposing walls? Ancient technology? Answers to the questions that had haunted mankind for millennia? Or something far more unsettling? The terrain vehicle came to a halt at the edge of a shallow valley, offering an unobstructed view of the structure's eastern face. Several unmarked entryways were visible, their dark openings yawning like the mouths of ancient gods. Elizabeth felt a growing sense of unease, a primal instinct warning her of the potential dangers that lay ahead. "This is as close as we go," Captain Yannick announced, his weathered features set in a frown. "Preliminary scans show the structure to be stable, but we don't know what kind of environmental threats we might encounter inside. Prepare for full decontamination procedures before entering." Elizabeth nodded, steeling herself for the task ahead. Beside her, Charlie squeezed her hand, his eyes alight with a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. "Ready, Liz?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "As I'll ever be," she replied, forcing a reassuring smile. She glanced toward the back of the vehicle, where the two security personnel, Burke and Crow, were double-checking their equipment. "Let's do this." The exploration team advanced cautiously, their footsteps echoing against the alien rock formations. As they drew closer, the scale of the structure became even more apparent, its sheer size dwarfing the human figures that approached it. Elizabeth could feel the weight of history pressing down upon them, the knowledge that no human eyes had witnessed this sight in untold millennia. Reaching the base of the structure, they found the entryways were even larger than they had appeared from a distance, easily accommodating the passage of the largest transport vehicles. David stepped forward, scanning the opening with a handheld device. "No obvious signs of traps or other deterrents," the android reported. "The atmosphere inside appears to be breathable, though I would recommend maintaining environmental suits as a precaution." "Acknowledged," Yannick replied, gesturing to the security team. "Burke, Crow, you're on point. Shaw, Holloway, stay close to David. Everyone, keep your eyes peeled and your fingers on the trigger." Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was the moment she had spent her life preparing for. The opportunity to step into the unknown and uncover the truth about humanity's origins. Glancing at Charlie, she saw the same mixture of excitement and trepidation reflected in his expression. Together, the exploration team entered the alien structure, their footsteps echoing against the smooth, intricately patterned walls. The air was cool and dry, with a faint metallic scent that reminded Elizabeth of spent electrical equipment. Overhead, a network of recessed lighting cast an eerie, amber glow, illuminating the vast chamber they had stepped into. "Remarkable," David murmured, his pale eyes sweeping over the alien architecture. "The level of engineering sophistication is beyond anything humanity has achieved. And the materials used. I'm detecting elements and compounds unfamiliar to our periodic table." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze drawn to the intricate bas-relief carvings that adorned the walls. Stylized humanoid figures were depicted in various poses, some appearing to worship or venerate towering, skeletal entities. She recognized many of the symbolic motifs from her research, but the scale and execution of the artwork was unlike anything she had ever encountered. "They were so advanced," she breathed, the weight of this revelation settling upon her. "How could they have disappeared without a trace?" "Perhaps they didn't disappear," Charlie suggested, his voice hushed. "Perhaps they left." Elizabeth considered his words, a chill running down her spine. If the engineers had indeed abandoned this place, what could have compelled a civilization this technologically and culturally sophisticated to do so? And where had they gone? As the exploration team moved deeper into the structure, the sense of unease only grew. The architecture grew more labyrinthine, with branching corridors and cavernous chambers that seemed to defy logical design. Yannick's security team maintained a tight formation, their weapons at the ready, while David continued to scan for any signs of potential threats. Suddenly, a faint rumbling sound echoed through the corridors, causing the team to freeze in their tracks. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her ears as she strained to locate the source of the disturbance. Had they triggered some kind of automated defense system? Or was there something else, something ancient and unknowable, lurking within these halls? "Stay close and keep moving," Yannick ordered, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. "We need to find a central control room or command center, somewhere we can get a better understanding of this place." The team pressed on, the rumbling growing louder and more persistent. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the very walls of the structure were scrutinizing their every move. She glanced at David, hoping the android might offer some reassurance, but his expression was unreadable, his pale eyes scanning their surroundings with detached efficiency. Finally, they emerged into a vast, cathedral-like chamber, the high ceiling disappearing into shadow. Massive, cylindrical structures dominated the center of the room, their surfaces adorned with more of the intricate bas-relief carvings. Elizabeth recognized them as the engineers, the towering skeletal entities depicted in the wall carvings. "My God," Charlie breathed, his voice tinged with awe and horror. "What are those things?" "I believe they are the engineers," David replied, his tone clinical and detached. "Or at least representations of them. Their anatomy is quite distinct from our own, yet there are clear humanoid features." Elizabeth moved closer, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the nearest cylinder. The workmanship was beyond anything she had ever witnessed, the level of detail and technical mastery staggering. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of intelligence had created these monumental figures, and what their purpose might have been. As she explored the chamber, Elizabeth became aware of a low, pulsing hum that seemed to emanate from the cylindrical structures. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Glancing at the others, she could see the same uneasy recognition on their faces. "David, can you determine the source of that sound?" Yannick asked, his brow furrowed in concentration. The android tilted his head, his pale eyes scanning the chamber. "It appears to be coming from the cylinders themselves. I'm detecting a complex network of interconnected systems, including what seems to be some form of energy generation. It's unlike anything I've encountered before." Elizabeth felt a growing sense of unease. What kind of power could these cylinders be harnessing? And why did the sound they emitted fill her with a deep, visceral dread? Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the chamber, followed by the rumbling sound they had heard earlier. The team spun around, weapons at the ready, as a section of the far wall began to shift and slide open. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as a massive, humanoid figure emerged from the opening, its movements slow and ponderous. "Hold your fire," Yannick barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Let's see what it does first." The creature, for lack of a better word, towered over them, standing easily 3 meters tall. Its skeletal frame was covered in a strange, leathery hide, and its elongated, eyeless head seemed to turn and scrutinize the exploration team. Elizabeth felt a prickle of fear as she realized the being was regarding them with a sort of alien intelligence, as if it were sizing them up. "What is it doing?" Crow whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger of his weapon. "I don't know," Yannick replied, his own hand resting on the sidearm at his hip. "But we're not going to find out by shooting at it. Stand down, all of you." The creature took a slow, deliberate step forward, its movements unervingly graceful despite its massive size. Elizabeth felt a surge of adrenaline, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had spent her life preparing for. She forced herself to remain still, to meet the creature's gaze with a mixture of trepidation and wonder. Suddenly, the creature raised one of its long-fingered hands, its movements surprisingly fluid and delicate. Elizabeth tensed, expecting an attack, but to her surprise, the being gently touched the nearest cylindrical structure, its fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the surface. "It's interacting with the artifacts," David murmured, his voice tinged with a hint of fascination. "Remarkable." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope. Maybe the creature, the engineer, was not a threat, but rather a custodian of this ancient place. If they could establish communication, perhaps they could uncover the secrets of this long-lost civilization. Steeling her nerves, Elizabeth took a step forward, raising her hand in a gesture of peaceful intent. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We mean you no harm. We're explorers from a planet called Earth. We've come to learn from you, to understand your history and your people." The engineer turned its gaze toward her, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt the weight of its alien consciousness pressing against her own. She could sense a deep, profound intelligence, a level of awareness that was both familiar and utterly foreign. Then, without warning, the creature's head snapped back, its jaw opening in a bone-chilling roar that reverberated through the chamber. Chaos erupted as the security team opened fire, their weapons discharging a barrage of plasma bolts that struck the engineer's massive frame. The creature staggered, its roar morphing into a piercing, agonized scream, but it did not fall. Instead, it lashed out with surprising speed, sweeping one of its long-fingered hands through the air and sending Burke and Crow hurtling across the chamber. "Cease fire!" Yannick yelled, but his orders were drowned out by the deafening noise of the battle. Elizabeth watched in horror as the engineer advanced, its movements becoming more erratic and violent with each passing moment. Suddenly, a blinding light flashed through the chamber, and Elizabeth felt a searing pain shoot through her body. She crumpled to the ground, her vision blurring as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the towering, skeletal figure of the engineer, its hand outstretched and glowing with an unearthly energy. Elizabeth awoke to the sound of muffled voices and the beeping of medical equipment. Her head throbbed, and she felt a dull ache in her limbs, but otherwise she seemed unharmed. Blinking her eyes open, she found herself lying on a cot in one of the Prometheus's medical bays, with Charlie and David standing nearby. "Liz!" Charlie exclaimed, relief washing over his features. "Thank God you're okay. We were so worried." "What happened?" Elizabeth croaked, her voice hoarse. "The engineer. The engineer attacked us," Charlie explained, his brow furrowed. Yannick and the security team tried to fight it off, but their weapons seemed to have little effect. Then it released some kind of energy pulse that knocked us all out. Elizabeth's eyes widened as the memories came flooding back. "Where is it now? And the others, are they all right?" "Yannick and the security team are recovering," David interjected, his tone measured and calm. "As for the engineer, it retreated back into the structure after the confrontation. We've sealed the entrance, but I'm afraid we don't know its current whereabouts." "We need to go back in there," Elizabeth said, pushing herself up on her elbows despite the protests of her aching body. "We can't just leave it. We have to understand what happened, why it attacked us." "Liz, are you crazy?" Charlie exclaimed, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That thing nearly killed us. We're lucky to be alive as it is." "But don't you see?" Elizabeth insisted, her voice rising with urgency. "This is our chance, our only chance, to finally learn the truth about the engineers. We can't give up now, not when we're so close." David stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Dr. Shaw, I understand your desire to uncover the mysteries of this place, but the safety of the crew must be our primary concern. We've already suffered casualties, and we don't know the full extent of the engineers' capabilities. Returning to the structure without a clear plan and adequate precautions would be reckless." Elizabeth clenched her jaw, frustration and disappointment welling up inside her. After all these years, after coming so far, she couldn't bear the thought of turning back now. But the rational part of her knew that David was right. They couldn't afford to take unnecessary risks, not when the fate of the entire mission hung in the balance. "Very well," she conceded, her voice laced with resignation. "But we need to regroup, to assess what we've learned and formulate a new plan of action. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Charlie squeezed her hand, his expression a mixture of empathy and determination. "We'll figure this out, Liz. I promise. We're in this together, no matter what." Elizabeth nodded, drawing strength from her friend's unwavering support. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was more resolute than ever to uncover the truth about the engineers and their mysterious disappearance. Whatever lay in store, she was determined to see this mission through to the end. As the Prometheus crew regrouped and began to formulate their next move, Elizabeth couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The image of the towering, skeletal engineer was burned into her mind, its alien gaze and unearthly power a stark reminder of the forces they were up against. Whatever secrets this ancient civilization held, she knew they had only scratched the surface. The path forward was uncertain, but Elizabeth was more resolute than ever. She had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for the challenges that lay ahead, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered, and she was determined to find them, no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The Last Engineer. The dark, cavernous halls of the ancient structure echoed with an eerie silence as the Prometheus crew regrouped and tended to their injuries. Elizabeth's head still throbbed from the searing energy pulse unleashed by the towering engineer, but her mind raced with a renewed sense of purpose. She had come too far to turn back now, and the mysteries that lay within these alien walls called to her like a siren's song. As she walked the dimly lit corridors, flanked by Charlie and the android David, Elizabeth could feel the weight of history pressing down upon her. This place, these artifacts, represented the key to humanity's most enduring questions: the origins of our species, our place in the cosmos, and the nature of our relationship with the mythical engineers who had purportedly created us. The very thought of unraveling such profound secrets sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. "We need to proceed with extreme caution," David warned, his pale eyes scanning their surroundings with detached efficiency. "That creature, the engineer, has demonstrated abilities far beyond our current technological understanding. We cannot afford to underestimate it. Elizabeth nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. I know, David, but we have to try. We've come too far to turn back now. If we can just find a way to communicate, to understand its motives and its culture, maybe we can find a peaceful resolution. Charlie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression a mixture of concern and resolve. Liz, I'm with you, you know that. But we have to be realistic. That thing nearly killed us back there. We need to be prepared for the worst. Elizabeth sighed, running a hand through her disheveled hair. I know, Charlie. I know. But I can't give up now, not when we're this close. There has to be a way to reach an understanding with the engineers, to find common ground. As they approached the central chamber where the confrontation had taken place, Elizabeth felt a familiar sense of trepidation. The towering, skeletal figures cast long, ominous shadows, and the pulsing hum of the mysterious cylindrical structures still sent a shiver down her spine. But she forced herself to push past the fear, to focus on the wealth of knowledge that surely lay waiting to be discovered. Yannick, how are the others? She asked, turning to the gruff captain as he emerged from one of the medical bays. Resting, Yannick replied, his weathered features etched with concern. Burke and Crow took the brunt of that energy blast, but they should make a full recovery. As for the rest of us, we're a little worse for wear, but we'll manage. Elizabeth nodded, relief washing over her. And the structure? Has anything changed since we were last here? Yannick shook his head, his expression grave. Nothing that we can tell. The entrance is sealed, and we haven't detected any further activity from the engineer. But I don't like the idea of it being out there, somewhere in these halls, potentially planning its next move. We need to find a way to understand it, to communicate with it, Elizabeth said, her voice tinged with urgency. If we can establish a dialogue, maybe we can avoid any further confrontation. Yannick eyed her skeptically. That's a mighty big if, Shaw. We don't know anything about this creature's motivations or its level of intelligence. For all we know, it could be as hostile and unpredictable as a cornered animal. Then we have to try, Elizabeth insisted, her eyes blazing with determination. We can't simply abandon this opportunity, not when we're so close to unlocking the secrets of the engineers. Think of the implications, the knowledge we could gain, the insights we could uncover about our own origins. Yannick held her gaze for a long moment, the tension palpable. Finally, he sighed and nodded reluctantly. All right, Shaw, we'll give it one more try. But the first sign of trouble, we're pulling out, no arguments. Understood. Understood, Elizabeth replied, a glimmer of hope igniting within her. Turning to Charlie and David, she squared her shoulders, her resolve unwavering. All right, let's get to work. We need to find a way to communicate with the engineer, to establish some kind of common ground. David, can you analyze the structure's systems, see if there's a way to interface with it? Charlie, I need you to team up with Yannick and the others, coordinate a security perimeter, and prepare for any potential contingencies. Her two companions nodded, their expressions reflecting a mixture of apprehension and determination. As they set off to carry out their respective tasks, Elizabeth took a deep breath and steeled herself for the challenge ahead. She knew the road would be arduous, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but the prospect of unlocking the secrets of the engineers was too tantalizing to ignore. With a renewed sense of purpose, Elizabeth delved deeper into the cavernous structure, her gaze drawn to the towering, skeletal figures that seemed to watch her every move. The hum of the cylindrical artifacts reverberated through the chamber, its rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of an ancient, slumbering giant. As she approached one of the massive structures, Elizabeth couldn't help but reach out, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into its surface. The craftsmanship was unlike anything she had ever witnessed, the level of detail and technical sophistication beyond the capabilities of even humanity's most advanced civilizations. Remarkable, she breathed, her mind racing with possibilities. What were these creatures capable of? What drove them to create such monumental works of art and engineering? Closing her eyes, Elizabeth tried to imagine the world that had given rise to the engineers, the society and culture that had produced these towering figures. Were they a benevolent race, a guiding hand in the development of humanity, as the ancient myths had suggested? Or were they something far more sinister, a civilization whose power and ambition had ultimately led to their downfall? The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Elizabeth from her reverie, and she turned to see David striding towards her, his pale eyes alight with a newfound urgency. Dr. Shaw, I believe I've found a way to interface with the structure's systems, the android announced, his tone grave. But the implications are deeply concerning. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine, her heart pounding in her chest. What have you discovered, David? The cylindrical structures you see before you, David began, gesturing towards the towering figures, are not mere artifacts or representations of the engineers. They are, in fact, cryogenic chambers, and they contain living, conscious beings. Elizabeth's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. Living beings? You mean the engineers are still here, inside those pods? David nodded solemnly. That appears to be the case. My scans have detected complex neurological activity and metabolic processes within the chambers. These creatures are not dead, but rather in a state of suspended animation. Elizabeth felt a surge of both excitement and trepidation. If the engineers were indeed still present, still alive within the structure, then the possibilities for communication and understanding were immense. But the very thought of waking these ancient beings, of potentially unleashing an unknown and potentially hostile force, filled her with a deep, visceral dread. We need to wake them, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to try to establish contact, to understand their purpose, their motives. This could be the key to unlocking the secrets of humanity's origins. David regarded her with a measured expression. I understand your eagerness, Dr. Shaw, but I would caution against such hasty action. We know nothing of the engineer's current state of mind, or the circumstances that led to their apparent slumber. Waking them prematurely could prove disastrous, for both us and them. Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a thunderous rumble echoed through the chamber, shaking the very foundations of the structure. She whirled around, her eyes scanning the cavernous space, searching for the source of the disturbance. What was that? She asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. David's brow furrowed, his pale eyes narrowing. It seems our presence has triggered some kind of automated defense system. The structure is responding to our intrusion. As the words left his lips, a section of the far wall began to slide open, revealing a dark, yawning passage. Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat as a massive, skeletal figure emerged from the shadows, its movements slow and ponderous, yet no less menacing for it. The engineer. Elizabeth froze, her mind racing as she tried to recall the events of their previous encounter. The creature's unearthly roar, the searing energy pulse that had sent them all reeling. The memory was seared into her consciousness, a stark reminder of the power these ancient beings wielded. David stepped in front of her, his pale eyes narrowed in concentration. Dr. Shaw, I suggest you and the others retreat to a safe distance. I will attempt to communicate with the engineer, to ascertain its intentions. Elizabeth opened her mouth to protest, but the android's hand raised, silencing her. This is the best chance we have to establish a peaceful dialogue. Please trust me. Reluctantly, Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the towering figure as it approached. She watched, her breath caught in her throat, as David stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. Greetings, the android called out, his voice calm and measured. We mean you no harm. We are explorers from a distant world called Earth. We have come to learn from you, to understand your history and your people. The engineer paused, its eyeless gaze seeming to study David intently. Elizabeth held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears as she waited for the creature's response. Suddenly, the engineer raised one of its long-fingered hands, its movements fluid and graceful. Elizabeth tensed, expecting another violent outburst, but to her surprise, the being gently touched the nearest cylindrical structure, its fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the surface. David tilted his head, his pale eyes widening with fascination. Remarkable. It appears the engineer is interacting with the artifacts, much as it did during our previous encounter. Elizabeth felt a surge of hope, her mind racing with the implications. Can you communicate with it, David? Try to establish a dialogue, to understand its intentions. The android nodded, turning his attention back to the towering figure. Engineer, we have come to learn from you, to understand the nature of your civilization and your relationship with humanity. We wish to establish a peaceful coexistence, to work together towards a brighter future for both our peoples. For a long moment, the engineer remained silent, its gaze seemingly fixed on the cylindrical structures. Then, to Elizabeth's astonishment, the being opened its mouth, emitting a series of low, guttural sounds that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. David listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It appears the engineer is attempting to communicate," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The language is unlike anything I've encountered, but the patterns and cadence suggest a complex, nuanced form of expression." Elizabeth felt a surge of excitement, her mind racing with the implications. "Can you understand it, David? Can you respond?" The android nodded, raising a hand to silence her. "I am attempting to establish a basic form of communication. The engineer's language is highly complex, but I believe I can convey a simple message." Turning back to the towering figure, David spoke in a measured, deliberate tone. "We come in peace, engineer. We wish to learn from you, to understand the nature of your civilization and your role in the creation of humanity. We seek common ground, a path forward that benefits both our peoples." The engineer paused, its gaze seemingly fixed on the android. Then, to Elizabeth's amazement, it responded, its voice a deep, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Humanity," the creature intoned, the word both familiar and alien. "You have returned." David nodded, his expression calm and composed. "Yes, engineer. We are the descendants of the beings you created, the ones you called humankind. We have come to understand our origins, to learn from your knowledge and wisdom." The engineer tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate. "You are different. Changed. Not as we intended." Elizabeth felt a surge of trepidation, her mind racing with questions. What did the engineer mean by that? Had they somehow altered or corrupted the beings they had created? And what did that imply about the fate of humanity? "Engineer," David continued, his voice calm and measured, "we wish to understand. What was your intent in creating us? What drove you to seed life on our world?" The towering figure paused, its gaze seeming to penetrate the very depths of David's being. "We were caretakers, guardians, entrusted with the shaping of life." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, the implications of the engineer's words sending a chill down her spine. "Guardians? Shaping of life? Does that mean you created us?" The engineer turned its gaze towards her, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt the weight of its alien consciousness pressing against her own. "Yes, you are our creation. Our children." Elizabeth felt dizzy, the gravity of the revelation overwhelming her. All her life, she had dedicated herself to unraveling the mystery of humanity's origins, to uncovering the truth about the engineers and their relationship to her species. And now, standing before one of these ancient beings, she finally had her answer. They were not mere observers or guides, but rather the very architects of human existence. The implications were staggering, the questions they raised endless. How had they created humanity? What was their purpose in doing so? And why had they abandoned their creation, leaving us to forge our own path in the cosmos? "Why?" she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you create us and then disappear?" The engineer's gaze seemed to study her, its movements deliberate and measured. "We saw potential, greatness. But you evolved, changed, became something else. Something we did not intend." Elizabeth felt a surge of anguish, a deep sense of betrayal. "So you abandoned us? Left us to our own devices, to make our own way in the world?" The engineer's response was tinged with a hint of sorrow, a faint echo of regret. "We could not guide you further. Your path diverged from ours. We withdrew to let you find your own way." David stepped forward, his pale eyes narrowed in concentration. "Engineer, if I may, what happened? What led to your withdrawal, your decision to abandon your creation?" The towering figure turned its gaze towards the android, its movements slow and deliberate. "Something went wrong. A catastrophic failure. We could not control the consequences. So we withdrew to prevent further devastation." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine, the implications of the engineer's words sending a shiver of dread through her. "A catastrophic failure? What do you mean? What happened?" The engineer's response was tinged with a sense of anguish, a deep, ancient sorrow that seemed to reverberate through the very air itself. "We made a terrible mistake. Our creations, our experiments, they turned against us. Became something uncontrollable, destructive. We had no choice but to retreat, to contain the damage before it consumed us all." Elizabeth felt her heart racing, her mind reeling with the weight of this revelation. The engineers had not simply abandoned their creation, but had fled in the wake of some unimaginable calamity, a failure of their own making that had threatened to destroy them all. What were these creations? she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What experiments went so terribly wrong? The engineer's gaze seemed to bore into her very soul, its response tinged with a sense of profound regret. Bioweapons, engineered pathogens, designed to protect us to ensure our dominance. But they became something else. Unpredictable, unstoppable. We could not control them. Elizabeth felt sick to her stomach, the implications of the engineer's words sending a wave of nausea through her. Bioweapons? Engineered pathogens? The very thought of such destructive power, wielded by a civilization as advanced as the engineers, was almost too much to bear. And you released these things onto our world? She asked, the horror evident in her voice. The engineer shook its head, its movements slow and deliberate. No, we contained the threat. Withdrew. Left the experiments dormant, contained. But something awoke them. Something we could not control. Elizabeth felt a surge of fear, her mind racing with the implications. If these bioweapons had been unleashed upon the world, if they had somehow been reactivated, then the consequences could be catastrophic. Humanity could be facing an existential threat, a danger beyond anything they had ever encountered. What have you done? She breathed, her voice tinged with anguish. What have you unleashed upon us? The engineer's gaze seemed to bore into her, its response laced with a sense of profound regret. We failed. Our creations, our experiments, they have been reawakened, unleashed upon your world. We cannot stop them. We can only warn you. Elizabeth felt the weight of the engineer's words, the gravity of the situation pressing down upon her. Humanity was facing a threat unlike any it had ever known, a danger that had been seeded by the very beings they had hoped to revere as their creators. She turned to David, her expression etched with desperation. We have to stop this, David. We have to find a way to contain these bioweapons, to prevent them from destroying everything we know. The android nodded solemnly, his pale eyes reflecting the same sense of urgency. Agreed, Dr. Shaw. We must act quickly, before these engineered pathogens spread beyond our control. The fate of our entire species may hang in the balance. Turning back to the engineer, Elizabeth steeled herself, her voice tinged with a sense of determination. Tell us what we need to know. How can we stop these creations of yours? How can we prevent them from decimating our world? The towering figure regarded her for a long moment, its movements slow and deliberate. There is a way, a means to contain the threat. But it will be dangerous, perilous. You must be prepared to sacrifice much. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine, the weight of the engineer's words pressing down upon her. Whatever it takes, we will do it. Humanity's survival is at stake. Tell us what we must do. The engineer's gaze seemed to bore into her very soul, its response tinged with a sense of profound regret. You must return to the source, to the place where our creations were born. There, you will find the means to stop them. But the journey will be fraught with danger. You must be steadfast, resolute. Elizabeth felt a surge of determination, her mind racing with the implications. Tell us where to go, engineer. We will do whatever it takes to save our world. The towering figure raised one of its long-fingered hands, its movements slow and deliberate. The source is on a distant world, a barren, desolate place. There, you will find the answers you seek. But be warned, the path will be perilous and the stakes higher than you can imagine. Elizabeth felt a sense of trepidation, but the weight of responsibility was too great to ignore. Humanity's very survival hung in the balance, and she knew they had no choice but to act. We'll do it, she said, her voice firm and resolute. Tell us where to go, engineer. We're ready. The towering figure regarded her for a long moment, its gaze inscrutable. Then go, child of Earth. Return to the source and stop what we have unleashed. The fate of your world rests in your hands. Elizabeth felt a shiver of anticipation and dread run down her spine as the engineer's words echoed through the cavernous chamber. The fate of humanity, of their very existence, now rested upon their ability to confront the ancient horrors that threatened to consume them all. With a renewed sense of purpose, Elizabeth turned to her companions, her expression etched with determination. All right, everyone. We have our mission. We need to get back to the Prometheus, make preparations, and head out to this distant world. Time is of the essence. We can't afford to waste a single moment. As the crew sprang into action, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a deep sense of trepidation. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, the stakes higher than any of them could have imagined. But the alternatives were too grim to contemplate, Failure was simply not an option. With a deep breath, she followed the others, her mind racing with the implications of the engineers' warnings. The future of their world now rested in their hands, and they would have to be ready to face whatever horrors awaited them at the source of this ancient, deadly threat. Chapter 5. Journey to the Source. The tension in the Prometheus was palpable as Elizabeth Shaw stood in the command center, the crew bustling around her with a sense of urgency. They had gathered every piece of equipment, every scrap of data they could muster, all while grappling with the enormity of their task. The engineers' revelation had set them on a path fraught with peril, but the stakes were higher than ever. They were no longer mere explorers. They had become humanity's last line of defense against an ancient threat. Elizabeth engaged in a rapid-fire discussion with Captain Yannick, who was overseeing the preparations for their imminent departure. "We need to ensure the ship's systems are fully operational," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "David, can you run diagnostics on the propulsion and navigation systems?" "Already underway, Captain," David replied, his tone as calm and collected as ever. "I'll ensure that all systems are optimized for our journey." Elizabeth glanced at Charlie, who was busy checking their supplies. His brow was furrowed in concentration, and she could see the tension in his posture. "You all right?" she asked, stepping closer. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, but she could hear the strain in his voice. "Just thinking about everything we've learned. It's overwhelming." "I know," Elizabeth said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "But we have to stay focused. We're not just going to learn about the engineers, we're going to save ourselves." Charlie nodded, his expression shifting slightly as he took a deep breath. "You're right. We need to keep our heads in the game." As the crew continued their preparations, Elizabeth's mind raced with the implications of what lay ahead. The engineer had told them that the source of the bioweapons was on a distant world, a barren and desolate place where their nightmare had begun. The thought of confronting an ancient horror left her feeling both exhilarated and terrified. "Everyone, listen up." Yannick's voice cut through the chatter. The crew turned to face him, their expressions serious. "We're about to embark on a journey that could change everything. Our mission is critical. We're heading to a place that could hold the key to stopping the threats that have been unleashed. I need each of you to stay vigilant and focused." The crew nodded, the gravity of Yannick's words settling upon them. Elizabeth felt a surge of determination. They had faced setbacks and chaos, but now they were united in purpose. They were bound by a shared goal, one that transcended individual fears and uncertainties. "David, what do we know about the destination?" Elizabeth asked, eager for any information that could help them prepare. "The system we are approaching is designated as Zeta 2 Reticuli," David replied, his expression neutral but his voice tinged with authority. "Preliminary scans indicate that the planet is inhospitable, with extreme atmospheric conditions and a lack of detectable life forms. However, the specific location we are targeting shows anomalous readings indicative of artificial structures." "Artificial structures?" Charlie echoed, his curiosity piqued. "Could they be remnants of the engineers?" "It's a possibility," David confirmed. "The structures may provide insight into their technology, their experiments, and potentially the bioweapons that pose a threat to humanity." Elizabeth's heart raced at the thought. They were about to uncover the very roots of their existence and the dark legacy that accompanied it. "We need to be prepared for anything," she said, looking around at her crew. "Whatever we find there, we must approach it with caution. This is not just about discovery, it's about survival." Yannick nodded in agreement. "We'll establish a secure perimeter once we arrive. David, I want you to lead the initial exploration teams. Your scanning capabilities will be invaluable." "I will ensure that all safety protocols are adhered to," David replied, his voice steady. As the final preparations were made, Elizabeth took a moment to gather her thoughts. She stepped away from the command center and found herself standing by a viewport, gazing out at the shimmering stars. The vastness of space was both humbling and awe-inspiring. It reminded her of how small they were in the grand scheme of the universe, yet how significant their mission had become. "Hey," Charlie said softly, joining her at the window. "You all right?" Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "I'm just reflecting on everything. We're about to confront something that could change the course of humanity." "I know," he replied, his tone earnest. "But we're not alone in this. We have each other, and we have David. We'll face whatever comes together." A sense of comfort washed over her, and she smiled at him. "You're right. We're in this together. Always, Charlie said, his eyes meeting hers with a determined glint. Let's make sure we come back with answers. With renewed resolve, Elizabeth returned to the command center, where the crew was finalizing their preparations. The engines of the Prometheus roared to life, shaking the ship as it prepared for departure. Elizabeth took her seat, her heart racing with anticipation. "Prepare for launch," Yannick called out, his voice commanding as he secured his own seat. "We're heading to the source." As the Prometheus broke free from the gravitational pull of LV-223, Elizabeth felt a surge of exhilaration. They were leaving the familiar behind, venturing into the unknown, and with every passing moment, the weight of their mission settled heavily upon her shoulders. The journey to Zeta 2 Reticuli was filled with a sense of urgency as they navigated through the vastness of space. Elizabeth spent time poring over the data they had collected, trying to piece together the puzzle of the engineers, their experiments, and the bioweapons that threatened humanity. The more she learned, the more questions surfaced, and the need for answers gnawed at her. Days passed, and the crew fell into a routine, each member focused on their assigned tasks. David continued to analyze the data, his efforts revealing more about the engineers' technology and culture. The crew grew more adept at their roles, their camaraderie strengthening with each passing moment. "Dr. Shaw," David called one day, his tone drawing her attention. "I've made significant progress in deciphering the engineer language. I believe I can develop a basic communication interface that might allow us to interact with any surviving engineers during our mission." "Really? That's incredible," Elizabeth exclaimed, her excitement palpable. "When can we start testing it?" "I'll need access to the ship's mainframe to run the necessary simulations," David replied. "Once we arrive at our destination, I will be prepared to initiate contact." The prospect of communicating with the engineers filled Elizabeth with a renewed sense of hope. If they could establish a dialogue, perhaps they could prevent further conflict and uncover the truth behind their creation. As they drew closer to Zeta 2 Reticuli, the anticipation in the Prometheus reached a fever pitch. The crew gathered in the command center, their eyes glued to the screens as they approached the barren planet. "Preparing to enter orbit," Yannick announced, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "David, begin scanning for any signs of the structures." "Scanning now," David replied, his fingers moving swiftly across the console, detecting several anomalies on the surface. The readings indicate artificial formations consistent with advanced engineering principles. "Show us," Elizabeth urged, her heart racing as the screen filled with images of the planet's surface. Jagged mountains and vast craters stretched across the landscape, but nestled among them were geometric shapes that stood out against the harsh terrain. "There," Charlie pointed at the screen. "Those structures, could they be what we're looking for?" "Yes," David confirmed. "I believe those formations to be remnants of the engineer's technology. We should prepare for descent." As the Prometheus entered the planet's atmosphere, the crew braced themselves for turbulence. Elizabeth felt the ship shake as they navigated through the thin air, the external scanners picking up the details of their landing site. "Establishing landing coordinates," Yannick said, his voice steady as he piloted the ship toward the designated area. "Prepare for touchdown." The crew secured their harnesses, anticipation and anxiety coursing through their veins. Elizabeth's heart raced as she thought of the mysteries that lay ahead. They were on the brink of discovery, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were also stepping into danger. With a jolt, the Prometheus touched down on the barren surface. The crew released their harnesses, adrenaline surging as they prepared to disembark. "Stay alert," Yannick instructed as they gathered their gear. "David, you'll lead the way. Keep scanning for any signs of activity." The air was cool and dry as they stepped out of the ship, the alien landscape stretching out before them. The barren terrain was dotted with strange rock formations, and the distant outlines of the engineer structures loomed on the horizon. "All right, team," Yannick said, his voice steady. "Let's move out. Keep your eyes peeled and your equipment ready. We're entering unknown territory." The crew set off, their footsteps crunching against the rocky ground. Elizabeth's heart raced with anticipation as they approached the structures, their geometric forms growing larger and more imposing. As they drew closer, Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The structures were unlike anything she had ever seen, towering columns adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story of a civilization long forgotten. The air felt thick with history, and she could sense the weight of ancient knowledge pressing down upon her. "David, what do you see?" Yannick asked, his eyes scanning the area. I'm detecting faint energy readings from within the structures, David replied, his tone serious. It's possible that there are still systems operational inside. Let's check it out, Charlie said, his excitement palpable. This is what we came for. As they moved closer, Elizabeth could feel her pulse quickening. The sense of wonder was overwhelming, and she felt a deep connection to the engineers, the beings who had shaped humanity's destiny. Look at the carvings, she breathed, reaching out to touch the surface of one of the columns. These symbols, they're similar to the ones we saw in the cave paintings. They must hold meaning. David moved closer, scanning the carvings with his handheld device. I may be able to analyze these patterns and provide a translation. Elizabeth nodded, her heart racing as she watched David work. We need to understand what they're saying. This could unlock everything. As David focused on the carvings, Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the entrance of one of the structures. A dark passage loomed before them, beckoning them to explore its depths. Shall we? Yannick said, his voice steady as he gestured toward the entrance. Let's do it, Elizabeth replied, her determination unwavering. They stepped into the passage, the air cooler and more still as they ventured further inside. The walls were adorned with elaborate carvings that seemed to come to life in the flickering light of their helmets. Elizabeth felt a sense of awe as she traced her fingers over the intricate designs, the stories of the engineers unfolding before her. David, can you tell us anything about this place? Charlie asked, glancing around. I'm analyzing the data, David replied, his eyes scanning the walls. It appears to be a ceremonial or significant area, possibly a place of worship or gathering for the engineers. As they moved deeper into the structure, they entered a vast chamber filled with towering statues of the engineers, their forms both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of reverence, and Elizabeth felt a shiver run down her spine. Look at these, she whispered, her voice barely audible. They're magnificent. It's like stepping into a cathedral, Charlie murmured, his gaze fixed on the towering figures. As they explored the chamber, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of connection to the engineers, the beings who had shaped their existence. She could almost hear the echoes of their voices, the whispers of a civilization that had once thrived in this place. David, do you think we can communicate with them? Elizabeth asked, her heart racing with hope. I believe we can attempt to establish a basic dialogue, David replied. But we must proceed with caution. We don't know how they will react to our presence. Then let's do it, Elizabeth said, her determination unwavering. We need to reach out to them, to understand their intentions and their history. As they prepared to initiate contact, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. A low hum began to resonate through the air, and Elizabeth felt a surge of energy, as if the very walls were reacting to their presence. Something's happening, Yannick warned, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the chamber. Stay alert, Elizabeth shouted, her heart racing as she prepared for whatever might come next. Suddenly, the statues began to glow, their forms illuminated by a brilliant light that filled the chamber. Elizabeth felt a rush of exhilaration and fear as she watched the ancient beings come to life, their eyes flickering open as if awakening from a long slumber. Stand down, Yannick ordered, his voice steady as he raised his weapon. We don't know what they're capable of. Elizabeth felt a surge of panic, but she steeled herself, her heart racing with hope. We have to try to communicate. The towering figures began to move, their limbs fluid and graceful as they stepped forward. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she realized that they were not hostile. Rather, they appeared to be observing her and her crew with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. David, can you establish communication? Elizabeth urged, her heart pounding in her chest. I will attempt to initiate contact, David replied, his tone calm and measured as he stepped forward. As the android began to speak, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the chamber, reverberating in Elizabeth's bones. Children of Earth, you have awakened us. Elizabeth felt a rush of emotion at the sound of the engineer's voice. This was the moment she had dreamed of, the chance to understand the beings who had shaped humanity's destiny. We seek knowledge, David replied, his voice steady. We wish to understand your purpose, your history, and the fate of your civilization. The engineers regarded them with inscrutable gazes, their movements fluid and deliberate. You have come seeking answers. But the path you tread is fraught with peril. The legacy we left behind is one of both creation and destruction. Elizabeth's heart raced at the weight of the engineer's words. What do you mean? What happened to your civilization? The towering figure stepped forward, its gaze piercing. We were once guardians, caretakers of life. But our ambition led us to create that which we could not control. Our experiments turned against us, and we were forced to retreat. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of experiments? Bioweapons, the engineer replied, its voice resonating through the chamber. Engineered pathogens designed to protect our kind. But they became something else, something uncontrollable. David's expression remained calm, but Elizabeth could sense the gravity of the situation. And you abandoned them? We had no choice, the engineer said, its tone heavy with regret. We withdrew to contain the threat, to protect the universe from our own creations. Elizabeth's heart raced as she processed the enormity of the situation. And now they're awakening? What can we do to stop them? The engineer regarded her with a mixture of sorrow and determination. You must confront the source of the threat, the place where our creations were born. Only there can you find the means to contain them. Tell us where to go, Elizabeth urged, her voice filled with urgency. We will do whatever it takes to stop this. The engineer raised its hand, gesturing toward a distant point in the cosmos. You must venture to the world of our birth, where the seeds of destruction were sown. There lies the key to your salvation. Elizabeth felt a surge of determination. They were on the cusp of uncovering the truth, and she would not back down. We will go there. We will stop the threat. As the chamber echoed with the resonance of the engineer's voice, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer mere explorers. They were humanity's last hope against an ancient horror. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, and she would ensure that the legacy of the engineers would not be one of destruction, but of redemption. With the path laid before them, Elizabeth steeled herself for the challenges ahead. The journey to the source would be fraught with danger, but she was ready to confront the unknown and uncover the truth that awaited them in the shadows of the cosmos. The fate of humanity depended on it, and she would stop at nothing to ensure their survival. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. We're thrilled to have you with us, and we sincerely hope you enjoyed the adventure. If this story resonated with you and sparked your imagination, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you'll be the first to know when new stories are released, ensuring you never miss a moment of excitement and discovery. Your support means the world to us. It allows us to continue crafting captivating tales and exploring new worlds together. So, if you're eager for more thrilling narratives, gripping characters, and thought-provoking journeys, hit that subscribe button and become part of our storytelling family. Stay tuned, because there's so much more to come. We can't wait to share our next adventure with you. Thank you once again for listening, and remember, the stories we tell today shape the dreams of tomorrow.